People come in late a lot. That's fine. 10 o'clock on Sunday morning is early. Hello. Okay. Good morning. Welcome to our very first fall forum of this season. And we are going to hear today about a very important topic, voting rights for all. And we have with us two people from the Minneapolis League of Women Voters. Kitty Weston, she's the Advocacy Director, Advocacy Action Director of the League of Women Voters Minneapolis. Oh, yeah. She's been an advocate for many years, and she's passionate about voting rights. And we have Marilyn Contasano. She's the chair of the Voter Services for the League of Women Voters Minneapolis for several years and currently serves as co-chair. She has been instrumental in getting out the vote efforts across Minneapolis. So the question we will be addressing today is, how do we ensure voting and the importance of making certain everyone has the right to vote without barriers or restrictions. Today you will be offered several ways to engage in the effort to make sure everyone has the right to vote and has access to voting. There'll be some time at the end of the presentation for your questions. If you are attending this forum online, you can type your questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your computer screen during the presentation. That will enable us to read your question to the speaker at the end of this presentation. If you're attending in person, make a mental note of your question to ask at the end of today's presentation. So I turn it over to you guys.
Thank you very much. Well, we really appreciated being invited here this morning. Marilyn and I and the League are very passionate about voting rights. So this morning, where's Alex? He disappeared. First slide, please. Actually, second slide. Second slide, please. So, voting restrictions have been in place since the Revolutionary War. So what we're dealing with now is really nothing new. When the Declaration of Independence was written and gave people inalienable rights, sadly, voting rights were not included in that. So the struggle has been going on for many, many years. Next slide, please. So we're just going to really quickly go through the demographics after the Revolutionary War and look at, who did we fight that war for? So we have the adult population. Next slide. And it was about equally divided, men and women. Next slide, please. Oh, this is all the same. Oh, okay. Well, we can just go to the last one. There was nice graphics here with lots of little pieces of the pie, looking at the number of people that were allowed to vote after the Revolutionary War. And basically, it was rich white men who were property owners and paid taxes, which was less than 25% of the population. So this has been a battle, it's been a struggle that we've been raging for a very long time. Next slide, please. So this is going to be a very quick history. Lots of dates here, but I'm just going to run through them just because I think it's important to understand that what we're dealing with today and in the last few years has been issues that we've been dealing with for a very, very long time. So, as I said, after the Revolutionary War, it was basically rich white men that got to vote. And nothing really changed a lot between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. At one point, more men got to vote, but that was sort of it. No other groups. So after the Civil War and the freeing of the slaves, we would have expected voting rights to have been granted to many more people. And in 1866, the 14th Amendment was granted, and we actually gave you a handout with those amendments because they're really important to understand when we're talking about voting rights. And what the 14th Amendment did was grant all persons, including former slaves, and guaranteed them equal protection under the law. After that, black men were able to vote, and they voted in huge numbers. And in fact, in those early days, they elected 22 black men to serve in the U.S. government, which was pretty astounding. And as you can imagine, it didn't take long for the people that wanted to suppress the black vote and votes to other groups got busy and started working hard to suppress the vote. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed, and this was an amendment that voting rights could not be banned based on race or by previous condition of servitude. So again, it was strengthening the 14th Amendment and explicitly saying you cannot discriminate against people of color. And as you can imagine, that just ramped up the efforts to deny really millions and millions of people the right to vote. And in fact, it worked. The numbers of black people voting went down. I think the percentage in those early years was like, I don't know, they got up to like over 50%, and it plummeted to like 2 or 3%. So it was pretty abysmal. Efforts to deny the black vote happened in lots of ways. Poll taxes, where it was basically you had to pay a fee to vote, and of course that would disenfranchise people of color that were struggling to, exert their freedom and get jobs, and poor people. And the leaders there, they really didn't care if poor people didn't vote either. And so it was pretty egregious. Literacy tests and understanding competency clauses in voter laws. I should back up just a second, because the Constitution didn't explicitly say voting rights, that it was a right for all. It left it to the states, and that really has kind of followed through to today, that every state is different and everybody gets to do their own thing and make their own laws. The literacy tests and the understanding clauses were just these egregious attempts to disenfranchise black voters. When a black voter would go and attempt to register to vote, he would get a paragraph from the Constitution that was very difficult to understand and very complex, and he would be asked to explain it. And it's been said that even constitutional scholars would have had a hard time. And a white person might walk in and get a very easy sentence to interpret and to be able to explain. There are stories about people that are registering black voters that would take their registration and drop it in the wastebasket in front of the voter, in front of the prospective voter. So it was terrible. In the meantime, during all this, other minority groups, women, people with disabilities, other groups were really working hard, Native Americans, to try to gain the right to vote. And that went on for a very, very long time. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, which gave women the right to vote. And that was after decades of the suffragettes really working hard, protesting, spending time in their courthouses and talking to their elected officials. And that was the start of the League of Women Voters. So we're really proud of that history. So fast forward to 1965. So during all those years, there's all this voter suppression. There's all these really, successful attempts to disenfranchise voters. the Voting Rights Act passed, and President Johnson signed it into law, banning literacy tests, enforcing the 15th Amendment. It outlawed discriminatory voting practices that were adopted by some of the southern states after the Civil War. That was huge. That was a game changer. And as you can imagine, the efforts to restrict the vote kept ramping up during all that time. In 1982, the Voting Rights Act was extended for 25 years because it was recognized that there were still bad actors there, and they were still working really hard to restrict people from voting. And then in 2013, next slide, please. In 2013, the Supreme Court ruled on the Voting Rights Act, and they stated that the pre-clearance clause, and pre-clearance clause was that the states that had a history of passing laws to restrict the vote had to get pre-clearance to put those laws into effect. And the Supreme Court reasoned that discrimination was no longer an issue in the United States, therefore it was outdated, therefore we didn't need that any longer. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously stated, "Throwing out the pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing out your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet." And very sadly, that prediction has come true. And there has been this really deliberate effort in the last, since then, 10 years, 9-10 years, to disenfranchise huge numbers of people. Since that ruling, lots of states have voted in really restrictive voting laws and making obstacles for people to vote, making registration really cumbersome or difficult, making it really narrow how you can register and when you can register and who you have to give your registration to, closing polling places in areas of the country or cities that there's a lot of minority people voting, making it really difficult for people that maybe have transportation issues or issues about taking time off, that can't travel a long way to find a polling place, understaffing polling places. So there's long lines, and I think we all have seen those pictures of some of those lines. Georgia's been especially egregious in that respect, and making it very difficult. The interesting thing is that even though there's been this really deliberate effort to discourage many people from voting, it hasn't worked all that well. People still find a way to vote because people really understand and believe that it is so important to vote. And so because those tactics aren't working as well anymore, now what's going on is really working to kind of undermine the whole voting system. And so this is really disturbing to us at the League and to people all over the country, because now we're looking at states passing laws that are really focused on that interference, putting their chosen people in charge of elections, allowing these people to change the results based on not the vote, not the count, but other factors. And so since the 2020 election, 19 states have passed 34 laws restricting voter access, and over 440 bills have been introduced in 49 states. So, we're certainly up against a machine that is trying hard to make voting a more difficult process. And one of the things that's happening now is that interference is that, really refusing to accept the results of a free and fair election. The 2020 election was one of the most secure and safe elections of all times, and yet there's still this real deliberate effort to sow doubt about that. to make people believe that somehow the voting machines don't work, or there's corrupt people in there counting the votes, or there's people harvesting votes, and all of these things are truly designed to make people doubt and to maybe just not vote because they don't trust it, or believe in the misinformation. And I think January 6th was a really good example of people really believing something, that the vote, the election was stolen, and that Joe Biden wasn't legitimately voted in, and we have to do something about this, and showed up to try to correct that. And as we all know, based on so much information and so many lawsuits and everything that's happened, that simply is not true, and yet still that's something that's going on. And I just happened to have a few minutes before I came here this morning, picked up the morning paper, and I was, in real time, voting machine security breaches increase concern. And it says that the stakes appeared to rise this week when the existence of a federal probe came to light involving a prominent loyalist to former President Donald Trump, who has been promoting voting machine conspiracy theories across the country. The more immediate concern is the possibility that rogue election workers, including those sympathetic to lies about the 2020 election, might use their access to election equipment. And so, that's happening in real time. And then right under that, activists contesting registration swamps election offices. And I've just been reading about this week, where they're getting people to go into election offices and question. And it's legitimate to do that if you have a legitimate question, who's voting in a vote. But it's spurred by conspiracy theories about the 2020 election. Activists around the country are using laws that allows people to challenge a voter's rights to cast a ballot to contest the registration of thousands of voters at this time. And that's overwhelming these officials who are trying to get ready for this midterm elections that are happening very, very soon. And again, it's this really deliberate effort to undermine our whole system and really undermine our democracy, because really democracy voting is the cornerstone to our democracy. So if I just left you with this, it'd be depressing and you'd leave here, oh no, what's happening? So what we're going to do now is I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Marilyn, and we're going to talk about what's happening to address some of these issues, and then I think real importantly, what you can do to get involved in this effort to make sure everybody has the right to vote with no barriers, and it's our democracy. So I'm going to turn it over to Marilyn. And how did I do with time? Okay,
good. You do good. Well, good morning. Before I tell you a little bit more about some of the things you can do, I just want to bring up the movement of Restore the Vote. And I don't know how many of you know, there's another major disenfranchised group in the United States, and that's people who have been convicted of a felony. So in Minnesota, the law is if you've been convicted of a felony, you cannot vote, not only while you're incarcerated in jail, but when you are out of jail also, and living in the community, and you're working in the community, and you're with your family, and you're with other people, and so you cannot vote until you're off, what they call it, off paper. It means that you no longer are on probation or have any part of your sentence that you need to fulfill. So there's many people, like 57,000 people in Minnesota, who are out of jail, but still cannot vote. And a lot of these courses tends to be many African-American population, tends to be indigenous population, Hispanic population. So there's a great deal of racial disparity in there. And some people, they have a sentence of maybe 2 years, and then they have 10 years on parole. Well, all those 10 years, they still cannot vote. Now, there's 2 states, Vermont and Maine, who don't they don't consider whether you have had a felony or not. You can vote even while you're incarcerated. Also District of Columbia. But there's also 21 states who say you just cannot vote while you're in jail. So that's what the state of Minnesota is trying to get passed. There's been a movement. There's been many times that it's been brought before the legislature. I think the last time was February of 2022. There's been a lawsuit now by the ACLU going to the Minnesota Supreme Court, which then that happened in November of 2021, and still nothing's been done. So this is something that I want you to be aware of, because if people talk to you about it, there needs to be people who can say, these people are out in the community. First of all, we let them out of jail, so we trust them enough to be out of jail. Then they need to vote also. And there's been studies showing that when these people do get to vote, they become more involved in their community. There's less recidivism, and it's and they get to show their children that voting is important. So I wanted to make sure you knew about that group of people as well, and that you can advocate for that change in the voting rights. Unfortunately, through the legislature, I don't think it's going to happen unless there's a change in our state legislature. So that's where you're involved in your voting. So I know Kitty talked a lot about the voting rights and everything, and there certainly is an undermining. The people who are undermining the democracy right now are shaping the narrative, and that has to change. We need to start shaping the narrative. And the threat to our democracy is limiting the access to our ballot and also undermining the integrity of the vote. Those are the 2 pieces of it. The suppression impacts, as Kitty said, impacts people of color in a disproportionate way. And we have to remember this is by design. It's not accidental that this is happening. And the goal, we want to have the goal be that we have a multiracial democracy where nobody gets left behind. That includes white people. They don't get left behind either, but not just white people. So how do we share the power and build a shared space? So that's, okay, what do we do? So the League of Women Voters is doing as much as they can to ensure voting is a right for all. And we invite you to join us or other organizations who are feeling this, do the same thing. And so we have the U.S. League, from the U.S. League to the state league and down to the local leagues. All of us are fighting to register, educate, and engage voters, to eliminate barriers to voting, and we want to talk to people about why voting matters. One of the things we're doing is we have a website, and a lot of these resources are on the handouts that we gave you, called Vote 411, and it's been around for a while. I was a league member when it just started, but it's really getting to be more and more useful. And you put in your address, and it's a voter guide, and it'll give you everything that's on the ballot in your area. If you're not registered to vote, you can go to it, and it'll help you to connect to the Secretary of State's office so you can register to vote. So if you know anyone who's not registered to vote, you can direct them there. It gives you all kinds of information on the candidates, and there's candidates questionnaire, which you can go to, and when you put in your address, you'll just get the candidates on your ballot, and you can look at how they answered questions that were sent into them. The other thing is on the Secretary of State's website in Minnesota and on the League of Women Voters Minnesota website, there's information on fair voting and voting integrity. So they're trying to get the information out about really how how elections are fair, and especially in Minnesota, and easy for you to vote. We talk about education. We have candidate forums, registering to vote, polling places. All that is included on all these websites. So what's the Minneapolis League doing, and how can you help? So voter registration. Our volunteers go everywhere. They're requested and they educate voters. We offer voter registration trainings, so they were online, and we're done for this year, but we'll have more again in the spring. We collaborate with community groups such as neighborhood associations, churches, organizations, health clinics. We're at fairs, farmers markets, stores, libraries, YMCA, YWCA, and we reach out to diverse communities. We're even working with the Timberwolves, so that's kind of fun. They're going to go into churches, and I tell you, when the Timberwolves sponsor a voter registration, people come. They're wonderful partners. And so we target communities who are traditionally underrepresented in voting. And we've been building a strong relationship, especially this year, with the Native American community. We target young voters. We go to the high schools for voter registration and education. Colleges, we've been working with the University of Minnesota, Minneapolis Community and Technical College, Summit Academy, and we try to register, educate, and mobilize the young people. Our Get Out the Vote efforts, so after our pre-registration ends, which will be ending in October, we continue to get out the vote efforts, and we're helping people make a plan to vote, being sure that the citizens know that they can still register either when they do early voting or that they can register when they go to the polls. In-person voter education takes place in, again, libraries and all these other sites that we were in. And at that point, we engage with the voters and we try to remove any impediments that they have to voting. Do they know where their polling place is? About 50% of the polling place changed this year with redistricting. When will they vote? Early or on election date? How will they vote? In person or absentee? Will they be able to get to the polls? Do they have a ride? Do they need child care? Although they can bring their children to the polls, it's important to ask that. Do they know where they can register, that they can register still at early voting sites or election day? We'll have postcards that will send to at least 3,000 registered voters in targeted communities, and we welcome your help with that, whether you're a member or not. Reminding people to pledge to vote, so please consider helping us with that. Education will be done on who the candidates are, and they can find out more about that on Vote 411 with our questionnaire, or on the candidate websites, or at our candidate forums. We have voter guides that are being printed right now, and they will be ready, unfortunately, tomorrow, not today, but we have them online. There's a PDF online, and that's just the Minneapolis voter guide. So we talk to people about how to vote, talk about all the candidates, and where to get more information. So please, if your church wants some of that, if they haven't been, if no one has contacted them yet, let us know and we can get those to you. There's also a Hennepin County voter guide PDF online, which is very good. Candidate forums, there's all kinds of candidate forums throughout the area. We have a League of Women Voters person from Plymouth here today, and they've had, she said, 13 candidate forums. So we have a few less in Minneapolis this year. Last year, though, with the local elections, we had 11. So this year we have, our next one is the Hennepin County Attorney Forum, which is on the 29th of September, and that's listed on your handout. And then we have one for the Minneapolis School Board on October 15th. And all of them will be live and in person, also live streamed on YouTube and recorded and placed on the League of Women Voters Minneapolis website. So I encourage you to watch those even if you can't get there. Another thing we're doing is we have written articles for newspapers and community groups, a series of articles and ads on the theme of your power and your vote, and we've gotten those out to all the local papers, and the ads have gone to targeted newspapers, and they will be coming out in September and October. We'll have those coming out to remind people to vote. We also, this year, new, is we have a billboard on West Broadway reminding people to vote, and that will be going up early October. And so that's kind of exciting. That's a new venture for us. So how can you help? So you can become a member of the league, of course, but there's ways to, even if you don't become a member of the league, like I said before, if you want to write postcards, distribute voter guides, we take them to all different community areas, and we even put them in little free libraries, so we need people to drive around and put those in, and that is very popular. You can educate yourself, and then educate your neighbors and friends. Get the message out people to people that the elections are fair, and find out more about that and be able to use your talking points. Take political interventions as a group. You have a ready-made group here. Sometimes a group is more effective than an individual. Look to start at the local level. So Kitty does a lot with the advocacy at the local level, and she last year talked to all of the legislatures, and so she invites people in via Zoom to be on that call and to also ask questions of the legislators. Support the candidates who share your beliefs. Ask questions of the candidates and find out where they stand on the issues. Work with nonprofits who are promoting fair voting and racial justice. Become engaged civically, a civic participation. Become a poll worker. Volunteer. We have an election night project at the league. You can volunteer for that, where we take everything in and check everything after the election is done, the night of the election. Don't underestimate the importance of community belonging. Ask and listen to communities as they tell you what they need, and don't assume that you know what other communities need. Take some risks. So that's kind of what I have. I think we're just about ready for questions, right? Perfect.
One of the things that I wanted to point out, and usually we say this right at the beginning, is that the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization. Yeah. And we do not tell people how to vote. And we would never tell people how to vote. We're just telling people to vote and to work against suppressing the vote, because again, we want everybody to vote. Now, honestly, I did a voter registration yesterday, and I did have somebody come up and say, well, you are partisan. At that forum, I had somebody come up to me and say, you're partisan. Those questions are partisan. And it's no, they are not partisan. They are the issues of the day. They sound partisan because we're so polarized now. Mm-hmm. And that's very different than it was even 10 years ago. So it's really important to know that we want everybody to vote, and we really don't care how you vote. Just vote. Mm-hmm. So we are open to any questions you might have.
Okay, so if you have a question, I'll bring you the mic, and I'll bring it to you. And we're going to alternate between online questions and in-person questions. And John is watching for, do you have some online too? Not yet. Okay, so we'll keep going with in-person.
I have a question about self-appointed poll watchers. Some states are having concerns about people coming and deciding that they are going to be the sort of the polling police. So is that a concern here in Minnesota?
Well, in Minnesota, people cannot challenge a voter unless they personally know the voter and personally know what the issue is that they're challenging on. They can't come in and say, oh, I don't like that guy, so, you better, I'm challenging him. They have to personally know of it. So it's very limited. The challenge is very, very limited in Minnesota.
Could you explain challenge?
Like somebody says, I know that person does not live in my district. That would be legitimate. I know that person, and I know he moved out of my district. Okay, that would be legitimate.
The question was...
oh, I'm sorry.
What was the question again? How do you challenge?
No, explain what challenge.
Explain what challenging is, yeah. Okay,
Well, that would
go
be
ahead.
what it would be, that
Right.
somebody would do something like that.
Yeah.
Would do something, and that would be an appropriate, say, I know that person is lying. I know that person, I live next door, and I know they moved, or something like that. But just saying, somebody goes in and just says, oh, I don't
like
think
that person's color, so
right, I don't think he
vote.
lives in my neighborhood, but they really don't know they don't know the person personally, and they don't know really anything about it. That would not be an appropriate challenge.
And the election judges are trained to address that issue if it comes up. And the reality is, because of the polarization, there are more issues with election judges, and election judges are, being threatened. And so I do think it's an issue. It's something that we and others are on top of. Secretary of State's office does a really good job informing people about challenging and what is acceptable and what's not. At the polling places, there are 2 people, one Republican and one Democrat, that are on the ground.
Right.
But that's really all. That's the only people that are supposed to be in there challenging. So, and the thing about even outside, they can't be intimidated, and we have to enforce if we're doing a forum, or if somebody shows up at a poll with anything that is supporting a certain candidate, that's not allowed. And we're trained to do that, and it's sometimes uncomfortable, but you know what? We're not shy.
And the election judges are so well trained, so well trained. I think a couple of you have said you have acted as an election judge, and the thing that's going to be really important is Secretary of State's offices. As Kitty said something before about that they're being challenged throughout the country, and if you don't have a Secretary of State who's going to be fair and believes in the integrity of the vote, then we're going to be in more trouble. Because here's part of the problem right now is we don't have just the person down the street saying, oh, that election's not fair. We have elected officials saying it. People who have been voted into office are saying this narrative, and this false narrative, and that we have to really guard against.
So, he's got an online question, right? No?
Live question.
You have a live question?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Are there areas where you have greater need? Is this on?
Almost.
Almost?
Yeah.
Okay. Are there areas where you have greater need for volunteers? And is it possible for someone who lives in, for example, a suburb to volunteer in Minneapolis?
Absolutely. Marilyn was talking about this postcard initiative we're going to be starting fairly soon, where we're targeting some of the precincts that have low voter turnout, to reminding people to get out to vote. And we need to address every one of those and put a little note on it saying, please vote. So we could use your help there. As this election cycle, our voter registration are sort of winding down. We're almost done with it. But you don't have to be a league member, and you don't have to be a member in Minneapolis to be trained as a volunteer to come and register people to vote. And I'll tell you, it's the most fun you'll ever have. It's just, there's something about it. It's so empowering. So yes. Do you have other ways, Marilyn?
Another question?
As the league
Go ahead.
member, also, I know I've gone to register voters of new citizens, and if there's ever a worthwhile experience, it's going and registering these people who have just become citizens, and believe me, they want to vote. So what's wrong with us? That we're like, not this group in particular, but, but I mean, really, it's really a really rewarding experience.
Yeah, amen to that. I've done that as well. It's fun. So any more? You got a question here? Okay.
Hi, I had a question about what was needed to register. I'm new to Minnesota from Wisconsin, and I went to register. I didn't have my Minneapolis driver's license yet, but I did have a car registration. I had a passport. I had things on it that showed that where I lived, and I was denied.
By who?
By the person who was registering me. And finally a friend who came with me, I was surprised, vouched for me, and I got to vote. But then I got a letter just last week that said there had been a problem with. So what do you need to register?
You don't really, really you just need to be a U.S. citizen, and you need to have lived in the county, for the city for the state for 20 days, I believe it is.
21 days, I think.
21,
I just
yeah.
did this yesterday, so
21 days,
it's
okay.
fresh in my brain.
And then I should let you do it, because I'm trying to remember. And you have to not have a felony conviction. But
I
you
met
should
all
be able,
those.
you should have been able to vote.
So all you
I mean, you
need
should have been able to
is-
register. You need
yeah.
the last 4 digits of your
Right,
social security
right.
number.
No,
You don't really
Not
know,
to
because
register.
they will check it at the Secretary of State's office. So no, you should be able to do it. Go ahead, do you have something, do you have?
The online registration
Oh,
preferred is a driver's license.
right,
The social security number is the alternate,
right,
right.
and then they register you,
right.
and they send it back to your address.
Right, and if it doesn't, if it doesn't come back to them,
A utility bill,
are you registered now? Are you okay now?
Well, we'll help you after, if you could stay
Okay.
home after a few minutes, we'll get you registered.
Did you try to register online or in person? In person. Okay.
That's disturbing to me.
That is really odd.
But how do they know that you're voting in the right precinct if they don't have proof? Like you're registering on the day of the election. How do they know that you're living in that
I
precinct?
think on the day of the election, you have to bring in proof of residency.
And I think it's like a utility
Yeah,
bill
a utility bill
or
or
something like that.
something, yeah.
It's really pretty simple.
If you pre-register, you don't need all that stuff. In Minnesota, some states you do.
Right.
Um,
Because it all goes to the Secretary of State's office.
And they
then-
check it.
And they cross-check it. And I had somebody yesterday say, well, I'm not sure if I'm registered, and it's very easy to find that out. And what happens if I register twice? And I actually asked Steve Simon about this, and I said, that doesn't matter, because the last one's going to be thrown out, because the new one's coming in. And you can't vote twice. But if you accidentally register twice, it is not a felony. So,
Yeah.
somebody back here?
Just to clarify, I have a granddaughter who turns 18 on November 5th, a Saturday.
Yes, she can vote. She can register now.
She can register now?
Yes, and be ready, and she can vote on her birthday, or on Election Day.
As long as you're 18 by Election Day, the
Yes.
next Election Day, you can register. And take one of our little cards, it's got a QR code on the back. She can just like hold it up, and she can go right to the Secretary of State's office. They want to do it online, the young people. So just, and she can just register. It takes only a few minutes. Yeah.
And she can vote.
Yeah,
Woohoo!
thank you. Good.
Congratulate her.
It's a good question.
I was surprised to hear that in Minnesota, that you can vote after you've been convicted of a felon. Once you said you're off paper, once your parole is done. I think I've read something before. My understanding was once you've had a conviction, your voting rights are gone for the rest of your life. So I wonder if you can speak to if that was specific to Minnesota, that you have a restoration eventually of your writing votes, or because I think you said like certain states like Maine and Vermont all the time, which is great. Then there are other states where it's restored. Are there states where it's never restored?
I don't think so. I know there are like 17 states that are more restrictive than we are. And so I can't remember exactly what all their restrictions are, but I don't think there's any states where it's never restored. But some of them, like, I don't know if you remember the stuff that was going on in Florida last year, they had to make sure if they had a fee that was due, a payment somewhere, they weren't able to do that. They weren't, even though they were already off parole, they still couldn't vote because they had to make a payment, or something. It was very, very restrictive. So there are states that are more restrictive than we are still.
And that's the problem that I was talking about, because every state gets to decide that there's no consistency. And some states are less restrictive than others. Some states make it easier, and some states make it very, very difficult. So,
I think that South Dakota, my home state, is forever denied.
Really?
Once you're in. I think so.
Really?
I think so. I'm not certain. I'm not
Let me
certain.
look at my
Any more questions?
list here.
We're almost time to finish anyway, so. Do you have any online, John? No. Okay. Last call for questions.
We were so perfectly clear.
Exactly.
There's so much information here.
You have a question?
And there's one right there, too.
Use this mic here, because online people want to hear you.
Okay, I should probably take this off.
Racial Justice is sponsoring a letter writing campaign for sometime voters in Georgia. And I didn't know about this meeting. You're my audience. So we're doing it next Sunday in Jones Commons, and then October 2nd, skipping the 9th, and the 16th and the 23rd. And we'd love to have you come and encourage some sometimes voters.
What hours will you be doing that?
10 o'clock to 9:45 to 11.
Next
So,
Sunday and then again in October.
yeah. And it's a total of 5 times. Okay?
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Something else somebody can do. And Myra, did you say you're North Dakota was yours?
South Dakota.
South Dakota? Okay, I'm looking here. It's North Dakota.
Do you think that we have a problem in Minnesota with voting machines? Is there an issue here, or I assume they work beautifully?
Well, there's been no evidence that there's an issue with the voting machines. Not that sometimes they don't break down or they don't have issues and problems because it's a machine, but there is virtually no voter fraud, and that, like, out of millions of votes cast, there's typically a handful of substantiated voter fraud, and I think out of the 5, like 3 of them were really like honest mistakes. So the voting machines are not changing the vote. They're, they're not the bamboo in the paper or whatever. I mean, there's so many conspiracy theories, and it's not my opinion. It's based on all the research, all the evidence that we do not have a problem. The voting machines are not faulty. But you're hearing different. From certain sources that are, and again, it's sowing doubt on the integrity of elections.
Aren't those machines rechecked before every election, rechecked over and over again? They're not tied to the internet, so they're not susceptible for some kind of international hacking. That's one of the good things about our state-by-state voter election systems, is that at least that doesn't happen.
You know, I think it's very curious that the people that say they have all this evidence that the 2020 election was just, full of voter fraud, and that it wasn't legitimate. And yet when they're questioned and challenged, they don't produce it. And they produce documentaries supposedly showing all this voter fraud and all these issues, and yet nobody else can find anything. Nobody can find any of it. And that's...
And all the lawsuits.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and all the lawsuits that there have been, and the judges have ruled that there has not been voter fraud. I mean, it's pretty clear.
I have a really quick little story, and I'll make it so quick. So my husband and I have a farm in Tennessee, a hobby farm, and rural Tennessee, but outside of Nashville. And after January 6th, the local paper had a headline, "Shame on Democrats." And I picked it up, and it was written by their House of Representatives, their elected official in Washington that was at the January 6th, and was saying that it was a peaceful protest, and only the violence was perpetrated by Democrats posing as other people, and that it was all a lie, and shame on Democrats. And these rural folks, it's in their local paper, it's their elected official, they believe it. I don't fault them for believing it. I fault them for not exploring it more. So our thing is educate, 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 understand. Don't just get your news from one source. But that's when it clicked in my head. I'm from Minnesota, right? I didn't even realize that could happen, that a paper would publish that. And it would go out to these folks that truly believe it. And it's very sad. It made me cry to read it, because I just suddenly had so much empathy for people. And then I thought, okay, well, maybe I need to get involved down here, and maybe I need to start doing what I can to help people really understand that they're being fed bold-faced lies. So, my last story.
So I guess we have to end. It's 10:50.
I just have to tell you, South Dakota does have the same restrictions we do.
Oh, they do?
Yeah,
Okay.
so
Well, I
people
stand
can get
corrected.
the vote back. Yeah, go
Okay,
ahead. Go ahead.
thank you. So, okay
Gotta
then,
clarify that.
we have to end, and thank you. So I'll ask for.
Thank you.
And, of course, we have more forums. Next week, we are celebrating National Recovery Month this September, which is recovery from addiction and alcoholism. So next week, we have 2 speakers from the Hazel and Betty Ford Foundation who look like they'll be pretty good as well. So thank you for coming. We'll see you later next week and beyond.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And if anybody does need to register to vote or anything, let us know, okay?
Yeah, we can hang out for a
Pick up
while.
a handout. They're right there on the table if you didn't get one.